Everyone wants to locate Zora Neale Hurston, the woman, to know who she was when she was at home, so to speak. But I can't think of anyone, unless it's Mark Twain, who is less knowable than Zora Neale Hurston. She is, without qualification, one of the best examples the United States can offer of the writer as consummate artist. Robert Hemingway, one of her biographers, calls her a natural actress. She was a performer through and through. As an actress, she was most comfortable in the role of satirist, and signifying a form of parody is one of her most familiar modes of self-presentation. Henry Louis Gates, Jr. calls her the first author of the tradition to represent signifying itself as a vehicle of liberation for an oppressed woman. She ignored the prescribed behavior for respectable ladies in her generation. She was brilliant, independent, egocentric. She made her own choices. For those qualities, she's sometimes been called a masculine woman, as if the qualities of independence, self-direction, and egocentrism somehow naturally belong to men. As if somehow Zora Neale Hurston stepped out of her place. Her place in this study is not the parlor, but the African diaspora. The U.S. South being one site of settlement in the diaspora, Haiti and Jamaica, two other sites with which she is concerned in her 1938 book, Tell My Horse. Hurston's is a voice from one of those certain communities of which the Martinican writer Edward Glissant speaks, meaning communities formed by people displaced from their homelands, cut off from those homelands for generations, and yet not fully assimilated into the dominant cultures of their new lands. Roger Bastide, a student of the African diaspora in Brazil, put his finger on one of the deepest tragedies of diaspora when he wrote that when a people is separated, as Africans were from Africa, they're cut off from the continuum of history in their homeland. The threads of African culture they bring with them, they must weave into a new culture with a new history and new memories that cannot be the same as those new memories, new histories being formed back in the homeland. He goes on to point out that an African-derived culture in Brazil is different from one in Haiti, and African-derived cultures in Haiti are necessarily different from those in the United States, on a different timeline, so to speak, and with many varied ways of weaving strands of African memory into new cultures, new situations, new histories. And no return can ever be an actual return, although the dream of return is very powerful among any dispersed people. In her autobiography, Dust Tracks on a Road, Hurston calls herself a vagrant, and her sense of vagrancy may be the most definitive mark she carries of her identity as child of the African diaspora. Like Cudjoe Lewis, an elderly man taken from Africa as a child, whom she writes about in Dust Tracks and elsewhere, Hurston herself retains, quote, that tragic sense of loss, that yearning for blood and cultural ties, the sense of mutilation that comes from being torn from one's home, end quote. Born in 1891, not 1901, as she liked to say, she began her vagrancy in the U.S. South at the turn of the 20th century, traveling with a troupe of actors through the region. She went north to Washington and then New York, then returned to the South to begin her field work as an anthropologist, and subsequently traveled even farther south into Jamaica and Haiti. Her life would end in Florida in 1960, not too far, geographically speaking, from where she was born. In other ways, however, Hurston had traveled very far. One comes away from Dust Tracks with the feeling that for Hurston, vagrancy was a route to something, not the aimless thing we usually think about when we hear the word. Anyone who's read her work knows that she's possessed a faith in human potentiality which was made possible by, not thwarted by, her understanding of the ways that culture frames and directs the individual life. Hurston, at least from the time her mother died, was always in search of home, which is fundamentally a search for self, understood in terms of place. Her imagination of home was large, with geographical scope and historical depth. About 40 years ago, Nathan Huggins observed that the line between Zora Hurston's mind and her material was never clear, an observation that certainly applies to both Mules and Men and Tell My Horse, the latter a book that's been roundly condemned by many who read it straight, as a supposedly objective account of Haiti and Jamaica in the late 1930s. What it is instead is part parody, highly satiric, of the U.S. occupation of Haiti from 1919 to 1934. It is also partly an attempt to familiarize Vodun as a religion, not so different from any other religion, in an effort to distinguish the authentic Vodun from its sensationalistic presentation in U.S. popular culture. And finally, a big part of it is revelation of what it meant to be black, American, and female in the late 1930s. In addition, I think the book does reveal something of Hurston, the woman. The title itself announces its satiric intent. Parlez chevalu, or Tell My Horse, was, Hurston reports, shouted every day in Haiti. It was the cry of the peasant or working man or woman announcing his or her possession by what Hurston calls the only indigenous law in Haiti, the brave Gide. Possessed by the brave Gide, an individual who did not typically have much of a voice at all could say anything, however insulting or obscene or crude. The target of this form of specifying was usually a member of the elite. Hurston writes, "You can see the brave Gide in the market woman, in the domestic servant who now and then appears before her employer, mounted by this god who takes occasion to say many stinging things to the boss. You can see him in the field hand, and certainly in the group of women about a public well or spring, chattering, gossiping, and dragging out the shortcomings of their employers and the people like him. This manifestation comes as near a social criticism of the classes by the masses as anything in all Haiti." When Hurston titles her book, Tell My Horse, she announces its purpose and gives us a blueprint for reading it. Unfortunately, it's a guide that's been ignored. Tell My Horse is an imaginative work. It is a subjective account of Hurston's travels in Jamaica from April to September of 1936 and her travels in Haiti the following year from September 36 to September 1937. On the very first page, she announces her project as a quest for healing. She had come to the West Indies to continue the studies of voodoo pharmaceutics that she had begun in Florida and Louisiana, and she would divide much of her time between the physicians and health workers of the elite classes and the mambos and bokors of the peasantry, as she studied poisons and antidotes, curative potions, and rituals of all kinds. Yet healing for Hurston was as much a matter of cultural and personal healing as it was a matter of bodily repair. And finally, it was the healing of the diaspora in new cultural formations that she sought. Tell My Horse is a performance. Hurston ends several chapters with the exclamation, "Ah, Bobo," which was used in Rada ceremonies to suggest a job completed, a song well sung, a completion. Tell My Horse includes accounts of burial ceremonies and other rituals, class snobbery, the rise of the spirit of nationalism in the aftermath of the occupation. Hurston recounts the most familiar episodes of Haitian history, quote, "the way the people tell it," end quote, excuse me, including the story of the queen whose paramour was a goat, and the story of the violent death of LeConte, one of the presidents of Haiti. Excuse me. She discusses the various gods of Vodun at some length and describes the ceremonies in which they're called forth and fed. She summarizes her consultations with government officials and physicians. She makes the acquaintance of powerful Wangans and Bokors and Mambos. She goes hunting for the wild boar with Jamaican Maroons. Tell My Horse is a rich account of her time in the Caribbean. The book deploys questions of African survivals in the New World, the definition and viability of negritude, the discourse of authenticity, mimicry, and originality, colonialism and its domesticated offshoot paternalism, black nationalism and what it meant in Haiti versus what it meant in the United States, the fate of Ethiopia under Mussolini. In Tell My Horse, Hurston is interested in the verbally and structurally fixed constructs of racial ideology in the U.S. and in the Caribbean, constructs like the white man's burden and black dependency, constructs of white innovation and black imitation, racist constructs of black degeneracy. She is interested in the heroic, in myth and history, and in fascism, indicated by her allusions to the appeal of Mussolini for Ethiopian boys and to the popular self-made man and health promoter Bernard McFadden. Read with an awareness of these and other historical contexts, Hurston's work comes into focus as an ongoing resistance to subjection of many kinds. Tell My Horse is at once a record of the fatalities of race, sex, nationality, and class, meaning those things we have very little choice over in our lives, and the record of her struggle to transform herself and everyone around her. Although most of Tell My Horse is devoted to Haiti, it opens with 5 chapters treating Hurston's summer in what was still the British colony of Jamaica. Jamaica, the narrator tells us, has more usable plants for medicinal and edible purposes than any other spot on earth, and her first stop is at one of the balm yards associated with pocomania, where baths are given to cure natural ailments and spirit possessions. There she meets Mother Saul and Brother Levy, their honorifics a subtle testament to the spirit of a black cultural nationalism at work in the country only a little more than a year before the riots would break out that would lead to the nationalist struggle in Jamaica. Very soon, the narrator finds herself the guest of Jamaica's elite in St. Andrew's Parish and later in St. Mary's. And there she's confronted with what she calls the colonial attitude, unlike the attitude she senses at the balm yard. Her perception of color, caste, and gender hierarchies and the challenges they pose to her imaginative project of forging a fluid and capacious black identity across the African diaspora quickly become symptoms of the modern woman narrator's dis-ease in Part 1. And in Part 1 of Tell My Horse, Hurston is very much not at ease. She is uneasy throughout the first 6, 7 chapters of the book. The first chapter is entitled The Roosters Nest, because in Hurston's words, quote, "Jamaica is the land where the rooster lays an egg." When a Jamaican is born of a black woman and some English or Scotsman, the black mother is literally and figuratively kept out of sight as far as possible. But no one's allowed to forget that white father, however questionable the circumstances of birth. You get the impression that these virile Englishmen do not require women to reproduce. They just come out to Jamaica, scratch out a nest, and lay eggs that hatch out into pink Jamaicans. The reference to pink Jamaicans, I think, was coined by George Bernard Shaw. The colonial attitudes of the pink Jamaican elite, in whose hands Hurston has been placed, are signaled in her own problematic presence within the Jamaican social order. A professional anthropologist, her credentials at hand, yet a woman and not especially light-skinned, she did not fit well into that order. Among the first events to which she is introduced in Jamaica is that of the curry goat feed. A huge feast, she writes, utterly masculine in every detail, and something that has never been done for another woman, she told some stretchers. It's so masculine, in fact, that, she writes, a man takes the part of a woman in the shay-shay singing and dancing that goes on after the feed. And in effect, what happens here is that Hurston is ritualistically transformed into a man for a good part of her time in Jamaica. After her regendering, Hurston has virtually no substantive contact with Jamaican women, although she will develop significant friendships with Haitian women in the second part of the book. Understandably, she's all the more aware of women and her own womanhood while sashaying through Jamaica in man-face. She performs the male role in her usual burlesque way, sporting a four-in-hand tie and swaggering at one moment, hiding a comb and mirror in her backpack at another, observing Jamaican women in the curry goat chapter with all the specular distance of the professional, that is, male gaze at that time, only to turn that objectifying view on its head in a later chapter entitled Women in the Caribbean, as she resumes the voice of the outspoken Western woman to damn the sexism of elite men. Miss America, she writes, world's champion woman. You take your promenading self down into the cobalt blue waters of the Caribbean, and you meet a lot of darkish men who make vociferous love to you, but otherwise pay you no mind. If you try to talk sense, they look at you right pitifully, as if to say, what a pity. It's not that they try to put you in your place. No, they consider you never had any. I think you might understand why this book has upset so many people. This is definitely Hurston's imaginative take on her travels in Jamaica, and I don't think we can pretend that it's an objective or very fair point of view at all. But although the last passage is pretty lighthearted, she launches into, almost immediately, a very serious story of a brown woman who was seduced, then shamed and betrayed into poverty and death by an elite man whose honor was more important than the woman's life. A tragic story. Hurston could do that, begin lightly, facetiously, ingratiatingly, and then unveil a harsh reality. The situation that confronts Hurston in Haiti is somewhat different. Haiti was the first black republic in the Americas. The Haitian Revolution, ideologically black from the beginning, was culminated in 1804, barely a generation after the American Revolution. Following the Haitian Revolution, there was some anxiety among U.S. whites that the example of Haiti would inspire U.S. slaves to revolt. Trade with Haiti was halted because of this fear, even though the South traded more with the Caribbean than with any other region in the world prior to the Haitian Revolution. Throughout the 19th century, recurring coups and stories of atrocities contributed to the white perception of the country as an ongoing threat to the United States. Stories of strange sexual practices, voodoo sacrifices, and zombies were used to confirm the belief among many U.S. whites that blacks were fundamentally incapable of self-government and, if left alone, would necessarily degenerate to a state of savagery. According to this view, they constituted a threat to the United States and most immediately to the U.S. Deep South. For many African Americans, though, the closest thing to an African home in the Americas had been Haiti. Living with the reality of being citizens of a racist country that continued to view them as dangerous strangers more than 400 years after their arrival, U.S. Americans of African descent had often looked to Haiti as a touchstone in the struggle toward equality and social justice. Some, like the famous black nationalist Reverend J. Theodore Holly, immigrated in 1861 and encouraged others to do so. Holly would become Bishop of Haiti in 1874, the first black Episcopalian bishop in the denomination. Frederick Douglass served as ambassador to Haiti, and so did James Weldon Johnson around the time of the beginning of the occupation. In the early and mid-20th century, with a modernist interest in the primitive, the growth of black expatriate communities in Europe and the Americas, and later the U.S. refusal to intervene in Mussolini's occupation of Ethiopia, which was a huge issue in the African-American press in the 1930s. Haiti once again burgeoned as a tropic site for dreams of cultural revitalization for blacks as well as some whites. It was imagined as, in J. Michael Dash's words, an alternative home by the African U.S. population. And when African Americans traveled to Haiti during the occupation to ascertain the activities of the U.S. government, they, like Hurston only a couple of years later, were inspired by the potential of the black nation, although even in Haiti they would be confronted with Caribbean cultural traditions that in some ways seemed to undermine, by drawing clear lines of demarcation among blacks on the basis of color and class, the very affirmation of blackness that U.S. citizens of African descent sought. The solidarity of a shared blackness across class lines, as it had been known and experienced in the U.S., partly as a result of the one-drop rules, a very ironic result of the one-drop rules that required people to classify themselves on census reports and so on as either or, either you're black or you're white, whereas in Haiti there had been a much more flexible system of classification and gradations of class and caste. But the solidarity of a shared blackness across class lines seemed much less real to visitors from this period to Haiti and Jamaica. Black travelers would also be confronted by the fact that they were seen by most Haitians as U.S. tourists, not as emissaries of an incipient black New World nation. Langston Hughes's memoir, I Wonder as I Wander, would show this very clearly. Later in the 40s, Haitian President Elie Lescaut very famously tried to harness the power of identification between U.S. Americans of African descent and Haitians by going to some lengths to make sure that the Haiti black travelers from the U.S. sought, a Haiti of solidarity between the elite mulatto classes and the black peasantry, was the Haiti they actually saw. Hurston's own journey was part of this more general impulse in African U.S. and more broadly U.S. culture, a preoccupation with self-definition in the face of a sense that one is uprooted. This gives a certain pathos to the project, because however much Hurston succeeded in writing a brilliant book, one of the conclusions she reaches is that she is, despite her time in Haiti, still a foreigner. This is very much a part of the message, that Haiti, for Hurston, turns out to be not home. But I believe that Hurston felt the loss of her dream of return very deeply, and it shows in Tell My Horse. Hurston's representation of her time in Haiti suggests that she interacts more freely than she had done in Jamaica with people across lines of color and class. Perhaps it's Haiti's long history of sovereignty and black nationalism that made such mobility possible. Hurston's relationships with black women in Haiti are represented as more intimate than her relationships with black women in Jamaica, where she is, she indicates, restricted to the masculinized role of spectator. In Haiti, Hurston did encounter sexism that interfered to some extent with her ability to get the information she sought, but she persevered. She visits many Haitian doctors, the physicians and scholars of the elite class, as well as the Wangans, Mambos, and Bokors of the black peasantry, who are among the most powerful community leaders presented in the book, commanding respect even among the elite. She devotes a considerable amount of attention to Loco, the Law of Medicine and Knowledge, and to the brave Jide. Both laws instruct their followers in the proper use of herbs and roots. In Haiti, Hurston represents black women as teachers. Her teachers are, she implies, her protectors too, as she negotiates the terrain. They introduce her to the two faces of Vodun, the Rata rituals and the Petro rituals, the former devoted to healing bodies and souls, the latter to the more violent policing of difference in the community, among other things. The Petro Bokors also had a healing role in the community. The Petro ritual was associated with fire, however, and had some dangerous aspects to it. Hurston was warned to be very careful. Her guides warn her to stay away from the Petro ceremonies because of the danger represented by another group, the infamous Secte Rouge, which had tied itself to the Petro ritual, but was actually more interested in using, this is what Hurston tells us, in using Vodun as a veil for crime than most of the Bokors of the authentic Petro practice. For Hurston, the Secte Rouge was a malignancy determined to maintain the status quo by exploiting despair. The suggestion is that they are at the root of disappearances and murders, or worse, the creation of zombies. She had heard the tales and recounts several. There are several recorded in the book, and I will just read one short anecdote that she gives us of a zombie and then talk about the most famous case that she talked about at some length. She writes, "There was the case of P, a young man. He died and was buried. The day of the funeral passed, and the mother being so stricken, some friends remained overnight in the house with her and her daughter. It seems that the sister of the dead boy was more wakeful than the rest. Late in the night, she heard subdued chanting, the sound of blows in the street approaching the house, and looked out of the window. At the moment she did so, she heard the voice of her brother crying out, 'Mama, Mama, sauvez-moi!' She screamed and aroused the house, and others looked out and saw the procession and heard the cry. But such is the terror inspired by these ghouls that no one, not even the mother or sister, dared to go out to attempt a rescue. The procession moved on out of sight, and in the morning the young girl was found to be insane. I determined to get at the secret of zombies," she writes. The doctor, Dr. Arthur Holly, said that I would not only render a great service to Haiti, but to medicine in general if I could discover this secret. But it might cost me a great deal to learn. I said I was devoted to the project and willing to try no matter how difficult. He hesitated long and then said, "Perhaps it will cost you more than you're willing to pay. Perhaps things will be required of you that you cannot stand. Suppose you were forced to. Could you endure to see a human being killed? Perhaps nothing like that will ever happen, but no one on the outside could know what might be required. Perhaps one's humanity and decency might prevent one from penetrating very far. Many Haitian intellectuals have curiosity, but they know if they go to dabble in such matters, they may disappear permanently." And he plants a seed in her mind at that point. With this warning in mind, Hurston proceeded to look for a zombie. Go figure. And today she's celebrated by many people for being the first to photograph one. The story, as Hurston reports it, is that Felicia Felix Mentor died, was buried, and years later discovered wandering in the vicinity of her former home with little memory of what had intervened. When she turns up at a farm that used to belong to her father, she manages to communicate this fact. The boss arrives and recognizes the sister he assumes to have died 29 years before. Her husband, who's remarried and is now a minor official, reluctantly identifies her as his former wife. When Hurston meets her, Felicia Felix Mentor is an inmate in a hospital. Of her first sight of Felicia, Hurston reports that the zombie, quote, hovered against the fence in a sort of defensive position. When she sensed the arrival of others, she broke off a limb of a shrub and began to use it to dust and clean the ground and the fence and the table which bore her food. And she showed every sign of fear and expectation of abuse and violence. When a doctor uncovered her head for a moment, she promptly clapped her arms and hands over it to shut out the things she dreaded, end quote. Notice that Hurston does away with the supernatural elements that are so frequent in the U.S. version of the zombie tale. The zombie is not dead, as U.S. legend holds. The zombie is not a creature who must walk only at night, so frequent an image in the motion pictures of the 30s, but a daytime laborer capable of mingling with others, horror out of bounds. The zombie is a familiar figure among Tell My Horse's physicians, who've treated them in sufficient numbers, Hurston suggests, to have speculated about the medical and social causes of zombification as a particular kind of catatonia. Hurston reports on the rumors of a special poison used by Haitian Bokors to simulate death. According to the people, however, the catatonic state zombification is used to pay the bamoun debt, that is, the give man debt, the debt owed to the pétrolier to whom one had sold one's soul for revenge or simply to produce cheap and docile workers. The zombie, quote, will work ferociously and tirelessly without consciousness of his surroundings and conditions and without memory of his former state. He can never speak again unless he is given salt, end quote. The zombie is familiarized as either a perpetrator of a crime or infraction of some kind or a victim of a brutally criminal form of retribution, sometimes both. Note the subtle reference in the story of Felix Mentor to the family property, a detail that may underscore an interesting and perhaps significant economic subtext to many of the zombie tales in Haiti. Perhaps Felicia's husband had made a bargain with the bamoun, and perhaps his debt had not been discharged with the gift of his wife, who was returned to him, a message that might easily threaten his ruin. It's no surprise at all that the occasional return and recognition of a zombie is accompanied by the gathering of angry people who threaten violence to the persons alleged to be responsible for the crime. And it was a belief among some of the people, in some of the peasantry, farmers and so on in Haiti, that a prosperous farmer or a prosperous landowner or prosperous industrialist would have many, many zombies working for him. But that was sometimes brought out as an accounting for prosperity in particular circumstances. Even though zombification was widely feared by all Haitians, Hurston chooses to emphasize the cultural significance of the practice for the elite. She writes, the upper-class Haitians fear too, but they don't talk about it as openly as do the poor. But to them it's a horrible possibility. Think of the fiendishness of the thing. It's not good for a person who has lived all his life surrounded by a degree of fastidious culture, loved to his last breath by family and friends, to contemplate the probability of his resurrected body being dragged from the vault, the best that love and means could provide, and set to toiling ceaselessly like a beast, and like a brute crouching in some foul den in the few hours allowed for rest and food. From an educated and intelligent being to an unthinking, unknowing beast. Family and friends may motor past the plantation where the zombie, who was once dear to them, is held captive, and its soulless eyes may have fallen upon them without thought or recognition, end quote. The fear of zombification in the two stories that I've just talked about references Hurston's earlier allusion to the Jamaicans' Roosters Nest, I think, the genealogical practice of the elite mulatto class, according to Hurston, to remember only their white fathers and in the process to deny their very real connection with the exploited black population through their black mothers, grandmothers, or great-grandmothers. 3 of the 4 accounts of zombies included in Tell My Horse emphasize women as victims or mothers of victims, and the Felix Mentor legend, as Hurston tells it, is virtually an allegory of the return of the lost mother. The fear of zombification, as Hurston construes it, attests to the open secret of the denied black mother. It is the manifestation of guilt on the part of the child at the betrayal of that mother, and through her of the black peasantry in Haiti, as well as a betrayal of Africa itself, to which the mother connects the child. So, Hurston deploys strategies of familiarization and defamiliarization to shake the zombie figure loose from the rigidities of its stereotyping in U.S. representations. In other words, the horror of zombies is rewritten as a horror of exploitation. Joan Diane, one of the best scholars today working on Haitian culture, writes that the zombie is, quote, born out of the experience of slavery and the sea passage from Africa to the New World, and tells the story of colonization, the reduction of human into thing for the ends of capital. For another writer, the zombie is, quote, a fantastic process of reification that means the total loss of my identity, the psychological annihilation of my being, end quote. For yet another, quote, the phantasm of the zombie does nothing but attest to the fulfillment of a system that moves the victim to internalize his condition, end quote. For Roger Bastide, the dead remain hidden in us. Importantly, the familiarized zombie defamiliarized the horrors of slavery and colonialism that still haunted the Caribbean and made them visible to her readers, most of whom were Americans. The zombie, stripped of memory and a will of her own, is a representation of the most profound losses of slavery: the loss of family and community, the loss of knowledge of one's history, the loss of memory, and therefore the loss of oneself. Felicia Felix Mentor, whether she was actually a zombie or only one of the inmates in a mental hospital presented to Hurston by Dr. Holly in an effort to keep Hurston away from the dangers of going zombie hunting on her own, is deeply significant for Hurston. At the end of the book, Hurston herself ends up inside the grounds of a mental hospital as a guest, she reports, of the famous Dr. Reeser, a white man, a former Marine who has gone native, as the white press would no doubt have put it, and has become himself a Wangan. She comes there suffering from serious gastrointestinal problems that she attributes to an attempted case of poisoning, either a warning from the Secte Rouge that she had gotten far too close to the truth of zombies, or an overt attempt, she seems to fear, to make a zombie out of her, to erase her as a conscious, individualized human being. For a woman like Hurston, an intellectual, self-directed, entirely independent, used to making her own choices, zombification represented the loss of all identity, an encounter with a monumental body of history, that is, slavery, that threatened to erase everything she had struggled to make herself. Moreover, Felicia Felix Mentor may have represented the very state of being, the very state of consciousness that Hurston was fleeing from the time she left Eatonville not long after her mother's death. In Dust Tracks on a Road, Hurston describes the days and months following her mother's death as days of emptiness. She seems to have been alienated from the past and from her own memory, much like the zombie. One psychoanalytic critic, Françoise Lyonnais, has suggested that Africa becomes, for Hurston, a manifestation of her own mother, Lucy Hurston. But it seems that as Hurston matured, went north to Washington and New York, undertook her studies, and began writing, that what once may have been felt as solely an individual loss was transformed into an awareness of a collective loss. Traditionally, the sublime, that confrontation with a reality that threatens to overwhelm, to erase the observer, is ironically the very experience that confers real individuality, real authority to the observer. And I think that Hurston's confrontation with the zombie, Until My Horse, is a confrontation with the sublime, an experience of the sublime. One commentator writes that it's the experience of the sublime that underwrites the idea of freedom of choice. Only by confronting something beyond the self's power to master, and through an act of will, turning away from the threat of annihilation, was freedom of choice secured. This was traditionally considered a male experience. It required courage. After all, to what extent was real freedom of choice ever in the hands of women? How many women historically have been free to choose much of anything about their lives? How many women historically have been free to work to support themselves? How many women have been free to travel, to set off on anything so egocentric as a path to self-discovery? Not many. But with the coming of modernity, a new woman appeared who could do those very things, and Hurston was one of them. Over the past generation or so, we've undertaken to locate what's variously imagined as a female, feminine, or maternal sublime stemming from a woman's confrontation with the terror of an overwhelming force oblivious to the claims of her humanity, whether that force be political in the form of state repression. You can think of many contemporary cases of the repression of women, cultural in the form of cultural exploitation, social prescription, and taboo, or biological in the form of the absence of or taking away choice with respect to one's body. We can locate in Tell My Horse a female sublime as Hurston confronts social and cultural forces that she felt threatened to erase her as a human being because she was a foreigner who asked too many questions, and perhaps because she was a version of the displaced woman. And here I want to emphasize again that Tell My Horse is a creative work of the imagination, not a simple documentary presentation of material. At the end, she turned away and returned to the United States to write Tell My Horse. While in Haiti, incidentally, she had written Their Eyes Were Watching God. As counterintuitive as this may seem, why didn't she stay, you might ask? Was she a coward? What Hurston finally confronted and understood was the reality of diaspora, the meaning of diaspora. What she discovered, I think, was the irretrievability of the past. And there is where she locates freedom of choice as a potentiality in her own life. When women began, as Hurston did, to court their own fears in the service of self-discovery, this being an act of self-assertion, the assertion of a right to choose between one kind of life and another, they find, quote, within the turmoil, as Patricia Yeager has said, quote, the possibility of transforming the burden of the past, end quote. And I think I'll stop there. Thank you. Now, I should say that I did not read from the book because the argument in the Hurston chapter of the book sort of depends on the chapters that come before. So what I did was try to reconstruct a portion of that chapter in a way that was more or less self-standing, and I'll be happy to answer any questions or hear any comments that anyone has. Yes? She was born 10 years before she said she was born, partly because she wanted an education, and it was much easier for her coming to New York in 1920 at the ostensible age of 19 or 20, rather than 30, to get into school and to get an education. She was born in, I hope I pronounce this right, Notasulga, Alabama. Her mother, Lucy Hurston, was a member of that community. Her father, John Hurston, was a little farther away, but also an Alabamian. But not long after her birth, they moved to Eatonville, Florida, and an all-black township in Florida, where she was raised. So there is a lot of confusion. A lot of people have claimed that she was actually born in Eatonville, and recently it was discovered that her birth was actually in Notasulga, Alabama, before her parents migrated to Florida. Oh, yes, the tombstone story. In the mid-'70s, I think it was 1976, Alice Walker, who was thinking along the lines that would lead her to write the wonderful essay In Search of Our Mother's Gardens, decided that she read something of Hurston's and wondered why this woman was not known, and decided to go search for her as one of the mothers. And so she went to Florida, went to Eatonville, and asked around. And eventually, in an overgrown field, an overgrown old cemetery, she found Hurston's grave. There was no gravestone there. There was no marker of any kind. And she put up a stone and began to publicize Hurston's work and her life and to talk about her in Alice Walker's own work. Yeah. So she has really come back from the dead, in a way. Speaking of dead writers. Yeah. Other comments or questions? Yes. Hurston took most of them. But I have noticed in reading, oh, I'm sorry. I do this in the classroom, and it's a hard habit to break. I've noticed that in reading some of the books about Haiti that were published before Hurston's Tell My Horse, some of those photographs appear in those books, like in The Magic Island by William Seabrook, The White King of La Gonave by Faustin Workus, and so on. So there were apparently some photographs circulating, but she also took her own photographs there. Okay. All right. Oh, I can walk. Okay. So she did take some of the photographs, and others I think she acquired.
Why did she claim credit for those? It's not anywhere in Tell My Horse.
No, it isn't. You know, Tell My Horse was written very quickly. Her publishers were impatient with her. She had a Guggenheim grant to go to Haiti, and she told the Guggenheim Foundation that she was going to write the proper voodoo book. Well, of course, they anticipated that she was going to write something documentary. She didn't write that book. I think she may have written the proper voodoo book after all, because there's a lot of voodoo that she's practicing on us, I think, in the book. But you know, she got back and she began writing the book in an apartment in New York when she wanted to be in Florida, and had to write very quickly. And I think it was a pretty chaotic process for her. Those are my speculations. Other questions or comments? Yes? Oh, it's hard not to say their eyes were watching God. But if we leave that novel out, I think her greatest contribution is in Mules and Men, where she comes back to the South not long after completing her studies with Franz Boas, the anthropologist at Columbia, and begins to do her field work there. And I think that what she preserves of stories and use of language in that community in Florida around Eatonville is incredibly important. And I think that what she creates in that book is a picture of herself as she would continue to develop that sense of hoping to know herself better in knowing the roots of her culture. And I think you see that Hurston in the process of being created in that book. Do you have a favorite? Oh, okay. Okay. Other comments, questions? Yes.
Can you speak a little bit about her with the Harlem Renaissance? Because it's my understanding that she became popular, and then they kind of the other African American or black writers at that time outcast her.
Yeah.
Her work to them was more voodoo-centric and really away from what the other Harlem Renaissance writers were talking about.
Yeah, there were two generations of Harlem Renaissance writers that Hurston was involved with. The earlier generation, Alan Locke and some others, supported her early on when she was writing her stories, her early stories, while she was still in school and still somewhat dependent, and thought that she had a great talent. But when she began to publish, and I think began to come into her own, there was some concern about her use of the vernacular that she was not presenting African Americans in quite the way that the older school in the Harlem Renaissance would have preferred. She was an unusual woman for that early period in the 20s in the Harlem Renaissance because she was so out there, so independent, so much a storyteller, a wonderful mimic, great at a party. She was very assertive. And so she clashed some with Alan Locke and others. But, when Langston Hughes' generation came in, they were as committed as Hurston was to the language of the people, writing poetry in the language of the people, trying to articulate the spirit of the lower classes, the working people. And so she had a home again of sorts for a while. But then again, whether it was sexism, whether her personality was just, hard to take at that time, or there are just all sorts of complicated reasons that she was, in the mid-30s, she became something of an outcast again. Richard Wright wrote a review of her work and said that she wasn't as socially conscious as he would have preferred. Others, Harold Priest and others, made the same comment that the real problems, Hazel Carby, I think, put her finger on it when she said that in that generation, the real problems of the African American were problems of migration and urbanization. So why is Zora Neale Hurston going back to the rural South and to the folk and writing about those people? Later, we would appreciate Hurston's decision to do that, but at the time it was considered something of a cop-out, perhaps. Other comments or questions? Yes. Why did I choose Tell My Horse? Well, it's a book that I think has been misread since it appeared. It's been criticized more often than it's been praised for Hurston's politics, which J. Michael Dash said that it was the only book written by an African-American writer who actually approved of the U.S. occupation of Haiti. She didn't approve of the U.S. occupation of Haiti, and you can tell it when you read the book. But this perception of what Tell My Horse is about just continues. Just a couple of years ago, someone else, hauled the book out of the library and did another rendition of this sort of criticism of it, always reading it as if it's intended to be a straightforward documentary. And I thought the book deserved another look, and a look from another perspective. So that's, and I also think the book has a lot to say about Hurston's struggle as a woman, which is what my book is about, Resisting History. So that's why I chose to focus on Tell My Horse. Yes. Mm-hmm. 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 I think there are strong threads in the book that constitute that sort of criticism of fascism. She mentions Mussolini a couple of times. And one of the ways that I think that one of the reasons we've misread the book is that we have read it as if it's a standalone work of fiction, like Their Eyes. Well, I don't think it is. Even though it's a work of her imagination, it's a very creative work, and you couldn't claim that it's documentary in any way. I do think that the best way to read it, or one good way to read it, is to read it in connection with what was going on in the African American community in the 30s. And there were great debates about the consequences of the American occupation of Haiti, which had only ended in 1934, and the presidency of Stenio Vincent didn't please very many people. Mussolini had just marched into Ethiopia, and Selassie was in exile. The African American press wanted the U.S. to go in to do something about Ethiopia, and there was some debate about it in Congress, but the U.S. decided not to do that, which was a great disappointment. So I think, in ways, the book speaks to, I'm going to use the call and response metaphor, but I think that might be pushing it a little far. But I think the book comes to make the best sense when you read it in conjunction with what's going on in the African American community in terms of intellectual, political, economic interests of the day. So the answer is, I don't think you can read it, that it's a simple addition to a certain kind of political literature. I do think there are elements of that impulse there. Other comments, questions? Yes.
I'm always interested in the relationship between Zora Neale Hurston and Hans Boas.
Mm-hmm.
Because when you read his books, they're generally so cool and scientific and exact.
Yes.
Almost to the point of being, for the regular reader, a bit boring.
Yeah.
You have with Ms. Hurston, you have this novelistic approach that brings all of this to life.
Mm-hmm.
I wonder, I know you wrote the preface to Muse and Men.
Mm-hmm.
Do you know what he thought about her work overall?
That's interesting, because Melville Herskovits, the other big anthropologist of that generation, had some reservations about Hurston's work. For example, when she proposed to him the idea of going to Haiti to do Tell My Horse, to do that voodoo book, he said, your command of Creole French is not good enough. I think we should send someone else. And then Hurston got wind of the fact that Katherine Dunham, the dancer, had been to Haiti. And she also came back and wrote a couple of books, which are much more straightforward, much more documentary, if that's what you're looking for. But Boas never really criticized Hurston's style. I think he understood who she was. Boas was the figure who came up with and publicized the big idea of cultural relativism, and Hurston trained under him. Prior to Boas, our museums were organized hierarchically. That is, you would walk into the door and you'd see the supposed primitive cultures from Africa and Asia and so on. And as you proceeded through the museum, you would work your way to the pinnacle of civilization, which was, guess where? In Europe and the United States. But after Boas and his idea of cultural relativism, museums began to change. And we all know how museums are organized today, geographically, on some geographical plan. So you might be in the Pacific Islands for a while, and then you might be in France. So all of that kind of hierarchical idea of culture was just raised. And Hurston trained in that new tradition, and I think could go back, unlike some of the early generation of the Harlem Renaissance writers and intellectuals, could go back and see working class black culture, rural black culture, without that sense of it being inferior. But I think Boas had a big influence on her and appreciated her. Yes?
Since Hurston was writing Their Eyes Are Watching God,
Isn't that amazing? Yeah.
And since many of us are most familiar with Their Eyes Were Watching God, do you see any influences of that lived experience in Haiti coming through in this other story?
Yeah, in fact, people have talked about that, about the voodoo that seems to be simmering beneath the surface of the story in Their Eyes Were Watching God. And I wish I could speak in some specific way to a particular scene, but nothing. Do you recall anything that reminds you of?
The hurricanes connected to Indian hurricanes.
Exactly. Yeah, the Vixama legend.
Life in the mud, it seems to me, is really much more not something that would be happening in Florida, but it would be happening in Haiti.
Yes, yes. So there may be that kind of undercurrent of that Haitian landscape, that Haitian social scape there with her.
Maybe some of the strength that she gives to Jane to speak out when she had been, as you said, degendered,
Mm-hmm.
or not being given her own voice.
Mm-hmm.
There she's got a character not only herself, but certainly speaks out.
Exactly, exactly. Yeah.
Comes on wearing overalls.
Oh, yeah? Okay. Overalls. Other comments or questions?
Could you talk about how her reputation has changed at various points since the time of her death?
Well, yeah. In 1960, she died unknown. You know, there was that horrible accusation against her in 1950 that she had sexually abused a young boy. And it was not true. It was disproven. But once you make a charge like that, it sticks. And, you know, her career began to decline. She ended up back in Florida. And she died unknown in 1960. And her career was pretty much in the doldrums until some people, you know, included her in the anthologies and so on. But until Alice Walker came by and began to look for her mothers and discovered Zora Neale Hurston in that process, in that search, Hurston was not widely known at all. There were one or two articles about her from the late 60s, early 70s, but it was 76 and Alice Walker. And that article in Ms. Magazine, I think it was in Ms. Magazine, I could be wrong. But after that, Hurston was rediscovered, and to me, the golden age of Hurston criticism was the 1980s, when people were really looking seriously at her language, at her signifying, at her, and discovering her. I think that since then, criticism has gotten a little bit mired in preconceptions about what Hurston is and who she is, and I think that attitude of discovery has waned a little, and there's a kind of, for me, there's a kind of paralysis in Hurston studies right now that we need to break through. If the spirit for intuition where the act was literally beyond only were on the one of the and medicine small hoppers that will turn it in verse dollar profit for never her keep on western on the day for your angels go he comes on her is deeply significant for instance. I think the end